We're going to do next. I'm going to go back in time a bit, and I'm going to play you a clip from 1998. Right? There's two reasons I'm going back in time. One is because the problems we're discussing about journalism are not problems simply of the moment. Right? These trends that Bennett talks about, they've been developing for a long time. They're not, it's easy to look at the contemporary media environment, especially the kind of spectacle-driven media environment, especially on cable TV, and sort of think of these as problems unique to the moment we're living in, but they're not. We're talking about long-standing professional norms. Right? So part of going back in time a bit is to remind ourselves of that. The other reason, quite frankly, is in 1998, who was president? Huh? Clinton, yes, thank you very much. Bill Clinton was president. And he belongs to which party? He was a Democrat, still is a Democrat, yes. Right? So in the book, there's a lot of critique of the coverage of the Iraq War, the Bush administration, a Republican. That's the material that Bennett draws on a lot. But again, none of this is unique to the way news media operate during a Republican administration. The same trends cross over time and the party affiliation of who's ever in the White House. So we don't want to get stuck thinking there's something unique about the way the news media operate when a particular party or person is in power. Okay. Because we're going back to 1998, we have to do a little historical work because not all of you were paying attention to politics in 1998, correct? Were you even in, that's like grade school for you. Okay. So here's the backdrop to the clip we're going to show. In 1991, the United States went to war in the Persian Gulf. We call it the Gulf War. The United States under President George H.W. Bush went to war against Iraq, correct? At the end of that war, Saddam Hussein was still in power. His armies were expelled from Kuwait, but Saddam Hussein remained in power. Okay. The United States, the United Nations had applied an economic embargo to Iraq during that period. So there was an embargo, what we call economic sanctions on Iraq. Iraq, no one could trade. Legally, no one could trade with Iraq. The United States was the main driver of those economic sanctions. The United States wanted to see Saddam Hussein gone. And throughout the 1990s, the economic sanctions, the embargo, was the primary weapon to do that, essentially to try and sort of starve Saddam Hussein out. The result was that the civilian population of Iraq suffered greatly. There was not enough food, not enough medical supplies, not enough parts to produce clean water and those sorts of things. Estimates vary widely. They tend to move from about 500,000 people to 1.5 million. Iraqis died during the 1990s as a direct result of the economic embargo. So we think often about the world as being at war and then at peace and then at war. But in some sense, in the 1990s, the United States was at war with Iraq consistently, in the sense that an economic embargo is a form of warfare. The United States also had a no-fly zone over part of Iraq, and there were little skirmishes here and there. None of this was enough to drive Saddam Hussein from power, which was the goal of US policymakers. So in 1998, the Clinton administration started talking about limited military action against Iraq, probably in the form of missile strikes. Not a full-scale invasion. There was no talk of a war in that sense. But the Clinton administration started testing the waters about the possibility of limited military action against Iraq. Okay? They weren't sure this was going to fly in the American public, so they sent 3 top officials out into the country to try and build support. Okay? Typical political activity. You want to get the US public on board for a policy, so you engage in a public relations campaign to some degree. So they sent 3 top White House officials, the Secretary of Defense, a man named William Cohen, the Secretary of State, Madeleine Albright, and the National Security Advisor, Sandy Berger. And they were doing a lot of media work to try and build this public support for a military strike against Iraq, February 1998. One of the key moments in that was what they called a town hall meeting that was broadcast live on CNN in February 1998. With Albright, Cohen, and Berger on stage in a big basketball arena at Ohio State University, right, with an audience, not only an audience in the arena, but an audience through the live television broadcast. And the whole goal of the Clinton administration was to build support. Remember, you read quite a bit in Bennett's book about these staged political events. I mean, does anybody think a meeting in a basketball arena covered live by a cable television network is really a town hall meeting? I mean, a town hall meeting in the traditional sense where the people of a community get together in the town hall and debate policy. That notion of a town hall meeting bears no resemblance to putting thousands of people in a basketball arena with a live television broadcast with 3 officials answering questions. Right, so remember that we're in this era of manufactured news, what one writer called pseudo events. It's real, it's happening, but it's created for the purposes of media and of public relations in this sense. Okay, so that's the setting. And I'm going to play you an extended bit of it to give you a sense of the tone. And then we're going to focus on one particular interaction between a questioner in the audience and the officials and the journalists. Because this is CNN broadcasting this, and 2 CNN journalists are moderating the event. Okay? So let's play the clip and, excuse me, and pay attention to all of the aspects of this, the staging, the actual dialogue and debate going on, and especially pay attention to how the journalist interacts in all this. There's a lot to talk about in this. First of all, apart from politics and ideology, we have to stop to make fun of Madeleine Albright for being a professor. Did you notice? She offered to, she didn't say, I'll talk to you as long as it's, I'll talk to you for 50 minutes, right? The time block for a Monday, Wednesday, Friday class. So. As long as there's this moment, some of you chuckled, where she realizes what she's into and she's in trouble. My favorite moment, or my favorite expression, is actually on William Cohen. Did you notice, the defense secretary? He's sitting there through the whole thing. You know how in a class where a professor calls on people to answer, and you haven't done the reading, and you don't know the answer, and you try to perfect this state of being in which you're conscious, you're awake, but you want to send out the I really don't exist vibe so that the professor doesn't come to you. So if you're too fidgety, you know, that will attract the professor's attention, right? If you really close your eyes and look down, that will indicate that you don't know the answer. So you try to perfect this, stare straight ahead, but pretend you are not really here. And that was William Cohen. I'm so glad Madeleine Albright is getting this question. I'm going to continue to look straight ahead as if I have no emotion and hope that no one asks me a question like this. That was rough. Okay. So what happened in that clip we watched? Well, you saw, I played a little bit of the lead up to that question because the program had this sort of typical feel of a nation mobilizing for military action, a lot of patriotism, a lot of invocation of the bravery of service people. And I'm not making fun of that, but that was the tone of it, okay? And then into that comes this question by the young man on the floor in the white shirt and the tie. Now, it probably was evident to you that he came intending to ask critical questions. He was part of a political group that opposed the possibility of a U.S. strike on Iraq. And he was down on the floor, which is where the questions were asked. And you could hear some of his allies up in the balcony. They were the ones doing the shouting and the catcalling. So there was a group, a fairly small group, that came to this event with the plan to try and challenge the administration. And to some degree to try to disrupt this photo opportunity. And you notice how that unnerved the CNN folks. Right, here you got this nice little staged event, and last thing you want is people shouting. Right? It's bad television in that sense because they've got a format in mind. Right? And you might say, well, yeah, it's kind of rude to shout, but in politics there's often that kind of give and play. If anybody's have you ever seen videotape of the British Parliament? In the British Parliament, the members of Parliament, the legislators, shout at each other, sometimes in far more harsh ways than this. So whatever you think about it, there's clearly a way in which this photo opportunity, staged, news managed, whatever you want to call it, event is kind of off the rails once people start intervening. Okay? And then this young man asks this very pointed question of Secretary of State Madeleine Albright. So here's what I want to use this clip for. Again, I always want to emphasize, there's a couple hundred of us in the room. We come from a wide variety of political perspectives and undoubtedly different political perspectives on questions such as war and peace. So I'm not showing you this clip with some expectation that you agree with any particular point of view. The goal here is to highlight these questions about news media, right, and these professional practices. So let's just sort of review. The young man on the floor is asking a very pointed question. Is he neutral? Do you think, oh, well, he's just, a citizen trying to get information. He's got no political agenda here. Does that, no, of course he's got politics, he's not neutral. He's got an ideology, yes? He probably has a perspective on U.S. foreign policy, on war and peace. He's clearly ideologically driven in some sense, okay? And you'll notice he's not very polite in a sense. I mean, he's polite. He looks like a perfectly fine young man. But he's very sharp in his challenge to one of the highest ranking members of the administration. Whatever else you think about it, it's a gutsy thing to do, to stand up on national television and face down the Secretary of State. I'm not sure I would have been as cool and collected as he was in such a situation. Okay, so would anyone say that the young man who asked the question was objective? Would you say, oh yeah, he was being objective? Well, no, you wouldn't even think of such things. Okay. He asked a question. He engaged in an exchange with Madeleine Albright. Okay. Then there was a follow-up question by Judy Woodruff, who is a CNN journalist. I think she's with PBS now. But so Judy Woodruff, she is taking the stance of a traditional journalist. She's not giving away anything about her own political perspectives or her point of view on foreign policy. She's trying to be non-ideological. Right? And there's a certain, I think you can say, politeness in her interaction with Madeleine Albright. Right? The question I want you to ponder is, from which of those interactions, the young man in Madeleine Albright or the journalist in Madeleine Albright, from which of those interactions did you learn the most? Which of those interactions generated in you thoughts that might have expanded your understanding of an issue or made you think about things you hadn't thought about? In other words, if you look at those two question and response scenarios, right, which one of them was more interesting, more useful to you? Right. I think that helps us understand what some of these limits of professional journalism that Bennett is talking about. Right. Right. Here you have a professional journalist and not somebody from some small station out in the middle of nowhere. This is a journalist from, at the time, CNN was the cable news network, right? Had established itself as kind of the definitive daily news source for a lot of people. Right? And so Judy Woodruff, nothing unusual about her. She's at the top of her profession at a major news outlet. And she's following these professional norms. Mm-hmm. And the question is, did those professional norms help her extract from a very powerful person the response that was useful to us as citizens? Or was, in fact, this questioner an overtly politicized person, right? Not claiming objectivity, neutrality, or any of that, more effective at providing that kind of response? It's an interesting question. Where do you learn more? Right? And if you think about this notion of journalists as adversaries, journalists presenting themselves as adversarial, how adversarial was Judy Woodruff in that interaction? She was almost apologetic. Right? So Madeleine Albright kind of tries to dodge this question, and it's not a simple question. I mean, foreign policy, is complex. The young man cites examples of what he believes are bad foreign policy decisions by the United States. He asks for an explanation for why there's apparently an inconsistent application of principle in American foreign policy. Well, that's not the kind of thing that reduces to bumper sticker kind of answers. But I think it's fair to say Madeleine Albright kind of is dodging and weaving a bit. She doesn't really want to talk about why the U.S. supports, in the 1990s, U.S. support for the Turkish campaign against the Kurds. Right? One of the most violent parts of the world in the 1990s was the Kurdish regions of Turkey, where the Turkish military was trying to destroy Kurdish resistance. It's a complex story, but the United States was a full backer of that campaign. The United States provided many of the jet planes that the Turkish military was using to bomb Kurdish villages. Right? Helping a country destroy civilian populations in a political campaign, you know, there's some questions to be asked there. And Albright doesn't really want to answer them because it's difficult to answer some of those questions. He presses, he's adversarial. Whatever you can say about the young man is he's clearly taking up a truly adversarial position. Judy Woodruff was almost polite and almost seemed embarrassed to have to ask the question. You know, Secretary Albright, you know, and she doesn't say, come on, fess up, let's get to the heart of this. She says, some people find it puzzling. She doesn't even ask the question in her own voice. She displaces the question onto some mythical other people. Some people are puzzled by. Right? There's a kind of politeness in all of that. And I think that's worth contemplating. Okay. So stepping back, right? Again, what we're trying to do in this class is look at the way systems operate. We're trying to look at how professional norms within journalism, right, help or impede journalists in their goal. And what is their goal? Their goal is to provide that independent source of information, analysis, and opinion that people need to function as citizens in a democratic system. That's the claim to special status. I've said this over and over. Let's emphasize it one more time. If journalism is anything more than simply another way to amuse us, if journalism has a special status in the culture, as I believe it should and many others do, that special status rests on journalism's ability to deliver to us an independent source of information, analysis, and opinion to help us come to judgment. Not to tell us what to think, but to help us come to our own judgments about crucial matters of public policy so that we can function as citizens. Because we know if the only source of information we have comes from powerful institutions such as the government or the corporation, that information is self-interested. That the information the government provides us or corporations provide us is going to be self-interested and in some sense fundamentally untrustworthy. It doesn't mean everything that the government tells you or everything that corporations tells you is a lie. That's not what I'm saying. It's saying that powerful institutions and people are likely to provide information to you that's self-interested. And therefore we need that critical, independent voice, which journalism claims to provide. And the question we're dealing with is the structure of journalism, the way it's organized, the professional practices of journalism, and the ideological framework in which journalism goes forward. We want to analyze that to see, does that system allow journalists to fulfill that crucial role? And the conclusion I reach, and many others have reached, is that there are aspects of that system that allow journalists to do that, but there are also aspects of that system that impede journalists from doing that. And the question is, how does that all work out? Bennett's book is an attempt to answer that question. And in some sense, this class is an attempt to answer that question. So what we're going to